Welcome back to the next episode of the Keto Naturopath on YouTube. Today we're going to get a little academic. We're going to stay to the blackboard, no field trip. So what I want to go over today is the concept of fasting versus protein-sparing modified fast, and what is it that our ancestors ate that gives us an orientation about perhaps how our diet should be relative to looking at these particular macros and the idea of protein-sparing modified fast. Okay, let's do it. Okay, let's get into fasting. So I give you a little history. I'm going to give you a little history of fasting here for the last 200 years. And the first thing, which is pretty interesting, is that our second Surgeon General, so the top guy of health in the United States, back around the time of the Civil War, just a little before, that he came out with advocating nobody should eat breakfast. Now you've heard that before, right? That's clearly an intermittent fasting reference. Clearly an OMAD sort of thing. Don't have breakfast. It's the healthiest thing for you. And his belief was that he thought the disease and all physiological problems came from excessive eating. And he wrote two books about it, one in 1900 and the other in 1985. Clearly you missed them, but they're still available. They're so worth reading. Feel free to look these up. But what is interesting in that is that from too much eating, it goes back to sort of the origins of the ketogenic diet and so on and so forth. But before that, it was all fasting. Fasting was a rage from post-Civil War up until the beginning of the ketogenic diet in the early 1920s. So what's up? That was the only thing they could get their hands on. There really wasn't a lot of medicines out there. There were botanical extracts. Naturopathic medicine was just getting started in for the most part, Cincinnati. And so this is all that they could do was a degree of fasting. And so that was it. So wait a minute, they had a problem with eating too much. So this is way before the processed food or the food industrial complex got started making all the junk food of today, which has clearly amped up that problem and made it a terrible situation. But it did pre-exist. It did pre-exist, not to the degree that it is now, but. And so that makes it interesting to sort of see that. Okay, and now in 1900, around the same time, Bernie McFadden, fasting, hydrotherapy, and exercise. He was out in Battle Creek, Michigan, at one of the sanatoriums there. Basically, fasting was his thing. He was a big milk believer and fasting. Well, that will change. Then after that, 1902, you'll catch the 1900s as being the big deal of fasting. Mark Twain was into fasting. Upton Sinclair comes up in a second. So Perfect Health. This was by Charles Hatkins of Norwich, Connecticut, 1840 to 1914. He was big in sort of detoxification and fasting used for those reasons, still immune sort of challenged issues. Then fasting for the cure of disease. This was a woman out in Seattle way. She published her work in 1908. She died in 1938. Didn't work out so well for her. She was a doctor and had her practice, and she taught people to fast. But the problem was the work garnered both national and international attention at that time, but led to starvation and murder of individuals. So she actually had to spend some time in jail, and she eventually, inadvertently, we'll say, starved herself to death. So fasting doesn't go on forever, folks. Fasting, vitality, and nutrition, 1908. Fasting Cure by Upton Sinclair. So he just came off of his public acclaim of The Jungle in 1904. And so he's all about fasting. And he basically goes back to the first guy who wrote about the skip breakfast, the second Surgeon General, George Cahill, which we'll get to in a second, and Bernie McFadden. Bernie McFadden was the one who taught Charles Atlas all about the weights and so on and so forth. That was the precursor to Jack LaLanne. Okay, so Jack LaLanne, in his own right, he had his TV series in the 60s and 70s even. He had a supplement company. He went around, he gave a lot of talks. And it was really interesting. He had an aversion to milk and milk products. I tend to share that aspect. We do have cheese, 2 or 3 times a year, but that's about it. And where I get my feelings, my opinions about dairy is not a good thing in this country, in the United States. it's primarily a processed food, is only after 16 years of seeing people across the desk and saying, you know, we're just going to take away dairy for 2 months and see what happens. We did labs on them and so on and so forth, but the definitive difference was, did they absolutely 100% take dairy out of their diet for 2 months and then bring it back in? It was a no-brainer. After that, it's, if everybody did this first before they saw me, I don't think I'd be seeing any patients. That's how strongly I feel about dairy, but this isn't a dairy talk. So anyway, there you go. So now let's get to George Cahill, who was in Boston, and then he went up to Dartmouth. He studied starvation. So he studied starvation in the 60s. And he primarily studied starvation in the 60s from the experience of World War II and the concentration camps, wondering why did people die after they were rescued? They ate themselves to death within a day or a week or so. What was that about? So he really took it seriously and did a lot of interesting experiments that are no longer allowed. So, but what I want to get is this graph right here. As you stop eating, what happens? Your blood sugar drops, right? You're not eating carbohydrates, you're not eating protein, so there's no dietary source of glucose. What happens after that? Well, then you have these, I call them packets of glucose throughout your whole body called glycogen. It's in your muscle, it's in your liver, it's in various organs, and it's meant to be used as your backup. So when you're out in the savannah or you're on a long car ride, whatever your trip across the big prairie is that you have a backup supply of glucose, and that's glycogen. It doesn't last forever, but it's your backup battery, right? So think of an electric car. It's got its backup battery. It's a big deal. Run out of gas. We have a Prius. So when we run out of gas, we can have some juice. But eventually the battery dies as well if it doesn't get recharged. So after that, after the glycogen disappears, you go into, now you're having to make new blood glucose from protein. New blood glucose from protein called gluconeogenesis. We've talked about it before. And that goes on as long as possible, for as long as there is enough protein for that to happen. While you're doing that, for the little bit of glucose that your body needs to run on, you're burning all the fat, if you have fat. So you're burning ketones. So now you're having ketones primarily as your primary fuel, and then a little glucose for parts of your brain and red blood cells and a few other things, nerve cells. Okay then, so that's the overall explanation of what happens. You see how that happens. Now let's see what it looks like. People have actually, we're looking at weight. Gee, is fasting good for weight loss? And the answer is that depends. If you're going to measure your weight loss only while you're fasting and stop measuring your weight loss at the end of the fast, you're going to find that, yes, you lost a lot of weight. But measure the equal amount of time that you fasted after the fast and see what happens. You're going to find 95% of the people gain it all back. So if weight loss is your sole reason to do fasting, you will get a short-term reward, but it will all come back. Let's take a look at that. So here's a 5-day fast. Drop down weight, plateaued. Here's the end of the fast. It came back up. Let's do a little longer. Same fast, same person. There's your, 10-day fast. Here's a 10-day fast. Look at all that weight loss. Down from, we'll call it 73 to 66. So that's 7 pounds. But the weight not only came back, it came back higher than it was before. That is not uncommon. It's called rebound weight gain. Not just the initial part, but rebound weight gain over what you've had. So these are real issues. So when you saw like TV shows, The Biggest Loser, they're going to work off these calories and fast. Well, they'll get a result. But once they stop doing that, once they stop that fast, they're going to start gaining it all back. Not a good thing necessarily. Here's another example of, there's the weight going down, 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 down. Here's your fat loss. Obviously, your BMI, basal metabolic indexes, are going to decrease as you're losing fat and you're losing muscle. Remember we saw that? But your metabolism, your basal metabolic rate is going to decrease, and it's going to make it harder and harder and harder for you to lose weight, to lose fat, because it's making sure that you are going to burn fewer and fewer calories. What else? Here's another person's fasted a 21-day fast. It looks sensational. They've dropped, they'll say it's 15 pounds. But they just sort of say once they resumed normal meals, you could see the weight coming right back up. So I would think twice about that. But here's why you would do a fast. You would do a fast to get into the correct glucose ketone index, GKI. That's a ratio of these two. And that is about immune sensitivity. That is about shutting down things that are needing to burn on glucose, i.e. various kinds of cancers and other conditions. So if you can drop your glucose down and get your ketones high enough, you'll come into a ratio of 1. So GKI of 1. How long would it take you to get there? Well, the person that did that 5-day fast that I showed you took him, it wasn't until day 3 of eating nothing but water, having nothing but water. Day 3. He stayed there until day 5 and he quit the fast. So he got into a therapeutic zone for those 2 days and then gradually started coming out of it. So it takes some effort to get there. And so when we talked about cancer as a metabolic disease, we talk about this with Tom Zegfried, and it starts with a 3-day fast. And then you go into a hypocaloric ketogenic diet, primarily a higher fat, not high fat, a higher fat, a little protein ketogenic diet. So the person doesn't die. We're not talking starvation at that point, but we're talking severely reduced calories to keep that therapeutic zone going. So what did our ancestors eat? And what do we know about that? Well, there's a couple studies that I'll put in the links, show notes below, should you be interested, and I hope you are, that they studied the isotopes. They studied the isotopes in our collagen, and they could determine what were the food sources of that collagen. Were they eating plants? Were they eating other animals? So what they found is that, and this is 130,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago, big swath of time in what is now Netherlands. And they found that mankind, men and women, in their collagen, they had the collagen of carnivores. So they ate the carnivores. And the carnivores ate the herbivores. And the herbivores ate the plants. And that was the orientation. Other things that they can assess now and say we are that person. So they're talking about Neanderthals. So you can say, well, we're not completely Neanderthals. Well, different topic, different rabbit hole, interesting conversation. But what we're saying is we have evolved from this set of genes, or this set of eating situation. Are we not that person still? That was rhetorical. You can answer it yourself. Some people can say, well, we've been eating vegetables for so long, so we're no longer that person. That's an answer. I don't think that's substantiated by research. But the other thing they go by is our stomach acid gets down to 1, which is more acidic than even some of the carnivores. And the herbivores don't have a very acidic stomach. So that was the other evidence that they look at, and they go into other digestive anatomical aspects as well. So I want to turn now to why is this useful information to know? Because when you go on a protein-sparing modified fast, what we're doing is we are fasting. So we are using the fat on us. But we are not going to go to the point where we need to turn on gluconeogenesis. We are not going to break down muscle protein to be used to make glucose. So we're eating the protein. We're eating whole food sources of protein. So while we are doing this, our body's going, so where's the glucose? What the heck is going on? And so we are in a low calorie, if you will, a hypocaloric daily diet because protein is very satiating. So we are on a fast. And so if you suddenly are eating pasta and donuts and so on and so forth, and you go, oh my gosh, I want to lose weight, and you suddenly day 2 stop all that, you're going to get quite a jolt. You're probably going to get headaches. You have to be, if you're coming from that context, you have to be gradual about what you're thinking. You're going to have to work your way away from carbohydrates, not just because they're addictive, not just because they're processed foods, because they're a source of glucose, and you're now going to be shifting your whole body, its metabolisms, to fat burning. It's going to be a little bit glucose. Glucose never disappears. But this is how people on carnivores and ketogenic diet, they say, I can't lose weight. Well, the reason they can't lose weight is because they're taking all this fat. So why do they think it's possibly logical that they can eat all this fat and lose fat? It isn't logical, and it's just stupid. Okay, here we go. This is the obvious reason. You are burning your fat because it's the easiest thing for you to burn. So we're not eating that macro. There's a little fat in with our protein, and it has to be there. It actually gives us a better sensitivity of insulin and better sensitivity of glucose for muscle use. So that's important. Just a little bit, not a lot. But don't worry about it. Protein, you're having a whole food source, you're getting some fat in there. The other thing is why it will really work so well is that your appetite decreases as you eat protein. You can't eat a lot of protein. However you try to force it, unless you're trying to make me wrong and have truckloads of protein, it's just not going to work. So as the percentage of protein increases in your diet, from no protein at all to even up to 40%, you can see that you start eating fewer calories than you need to burn. Okay, here's the other way of looking at it. When you're on a protein-sparing modified fast and feeling comfortable, you're actually under-eating calories. I'm not a calorie counter, but I'm saying this is where it's being burned off. This is why it works. So when you go to PSMF, this breaks a fat stall if you have lean, whole food sources of protein. Do not do protein powders. That question comes up all the time, unless you're in some hospitalization, some extreme situation. So have no doubt that protein-sparing modified fast is a temporary shock to your body. If you're not already in a ketogenic state, if you're not already in keto and you're fat burning, well, then it doesn't really matter. You probably won't even notice it. But if you are having to give up your carbs for this period of time, that's going to be a shock. So just be prepared. So we are using fat for fuel. We are not breaking down muscle for protein for use with gluconeogenesis, as we saw. So I want to end there. This is why that is. This is a big difference between fasting and protein-sparing modified fast that you should know about. And basically, this is how our ancestors ate. Do you think they ever ate a fatty lion or a fatty hyena or a fatty wolf? Probably not. Maybe the hippopotamus or maybe the elephant. But it's interesting from the studies that we know, and I'll put this in the show notes below so you can look into them as well, that we didn't eat those things. Till next time, take care.